And then I had posted last night on Supply of Grace this article on who were the wise men. I meant to schedule it for Tuesday. I hit the wrong button and it got published. So I guess we'll just talk about this today. Who were the wise men? I had all my life basically thought, okay, Daniel's prophetic timetable, 483 years unto God, which I always thought, and I still think that means all the way up until the birth of Christ. And then I said, well, I always thought, well, why were the wise men wise? Because they knew what year Christ was going to be born, and they went out, they understood prophecy, and they went out and went to find Christ. And I've said that for years on the podcast also. I have this year completely changed my mind about the wise men. When we started this series on the Gospels in chronological order I think this was back in March, April. We were doing Christmas in April, and I was thoroughly studied out the wise men, and particularly in Matthew 2. And I've completely changed my mind about the wise men. I don't think they were Jews. I think they were Gentiles, and I think they came from the Parthian Empire. So one of the things here, I also unusually filled this article with a lot of the pages from my PowerPoint when I talked about this many months ago. But the whole confusion about the wise men starts with the word Magos. Now, in Christendom, you're going to read a lot about the Magi. Who were the Magi? What were the Magi? The word Magi doesn't exist in the Textus Receptus. That was never used in the Bible. What God used was Magos. Now, weirdly enough, Magi is plural, Magos is singular. So how do you explain this? This was, you know, I had to start early studying the wise men because this has always confused me all my life. Modern translations will actually use the word magi in place of wise men when magi never existed in the Textus Receptus. So magos is singular in the Greek. Magos is the Latin equivalent, and magi is the plural of the singular magos in Latin. All right, are you still with me? So look, I have some pretty photos here of definitions for the word magos in Strong's, for example. Now, we don't give a lot of credence to Strong's in terms of Greek definition, but what you see in Strong's is what you're going to see in just about every place that talks about magos. This particular word they describes as a Magian, an Oriental astrologer, by implication, a magician, a sorcerer, a magician, a wizard. How do you explain this? And then Strong's Concordance, Strong's Exhaustive, Magion. It's a sorcerer, magician of foreign origin. It is basically Babylonian in origin, they're saying. Magian, an Oriental scientist, by implication, a magician, a sorcerer, a wise man. Well, what could this possibly mean? How do you explain sorcerer, magicians coming to Herod and going to worship Christ? Here is, now everybody says that this is the Greek equivalent of a Hebrew word of a similar meaning that was Rab-Mag. Rab-Mag. And the definition for Rab-Mag is chief soothsayer, an official of the Babylonian king. Rab-Mag, meaning Magian, chief Magian, a Babylonian official. And this lines up somewhat with Scripture. Now, we also have here, I just inserted Thayer's. I kind of appreciated what Thayer's had to say about Magos and Magian and Rab-Mag. This is talking about, what was this talking about? Would tell us much the same. This is about, what is this about? Oh, okay. So this is Thayer's Greek lexicon talking about Magos. But in the middle here, a Magus, the name given by the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, Medes, Persians, and others to the wise men, teachers, priests, physicians, astrologers, seers, interpreters of dreams, augurs, soothsayers, sorcerers, etc. So what I appreciated about Thayers was just the fact that even though Magos is singular, it is singular, but it's talking about a group of people that are made up of all these different positions. It's a group of people in positions of authority under a king that are teachers and physicians and astrologers and magicians, basically spiritual hucksters that are give advice to the king in Babylon. And this actually lines up in scripture. You consider Pharaoh had wise men. Exodus 7:11, after Aaron had thrown his rod down and it became a serpent, Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, now the magicians of Egypt. They also did in like manner with their enchantments. Pharaoh had his own wise men, but they were anything but wise. It's just simply what they were called. They were Pharaoh's Magos. Pharaoh had his own group of wise men, spiritual hucksters, personal spiritual advisors, and they came from all walks of life. They were the learned mystics of the time. They were the sorcerers and the magicians. They were false teachers. They were spiritual hucksters. Nebuchadnezzar had the same thing. You remember after the handwriting on the wall appeared on the wall in Daniel 5, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon. And then he says, look, give me the interpretation or you're going to die. Or I'm going to give you lots of stuff. And so who were Nebuchadnezzar's wise men? They were spiritual hucksters. They were his personal counselors. They came from all walks of life. Astrologers, Chaldeans, soothsayers, the book says. That's one of the benefits of being king of the world. You can have your own personal cabinet of spiritual hucksters to tell you lies. So Pharaoh's wise men, did that meet the definition of Magos? Absolutely. Nebuchadnezzar's wise men, did that meet the definition of Magos? Absolutely. I also have examples here of Jews being called wise men using that same term. David had his own wise men. Paul encountered a Magos. Did you know that in Acts 13? Paul and Barnabas encountered a Magos, and this was not a good person. Acts 13:6, and when they had gone through the isle of unto Paphos, they found a certain sorcerer. They found a Magos, a false prophet who was a Jew, whose name was Bar Jesus. So this Magos was a Jew who was a sorcerer, a magician, someone who deceived through trickery. He was using perhaps even demonic trickery to fool people into thinking he was a true prophet. A Magos is not always a good thing. That's the point. And the Magos has its origins in the spiritual hucksters who were under Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar. Now notice here too, in Matthew 2, there's something else that we have to take note of in order to identify the wise men. Verse 1 of Matthew 2 told us that there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. They simply had to be east of Jerusalem. But at the end of the story in Matthew 2, in verse 12, when the wise men went home, Matthew told us that they departed into their own country. The wise men came from another country. They are not Jews. They have to be Gentiles. There's no other explanation for that. They departed into their own country. They came from another, they're Gentiles. Now, some writers would say that because Magos has a Persian origin, then these wise men had to come from the far east, from Persia. And I thought Of growing up, I always thought, what are you talking about? There is no Persia in the days of the Roman Empire. That makes no sense. But there was something else that existed in the days of the Roman Empire that was east of Israel, another empire. And I have a map here to show the Parthians. What was once Babylon, Babylonian, Assyrian, years later in the days of the Roman Empire, they became the Parthian Empire. And these guys, the Parthians, you've probably heard them discussed in movies about the Roman Empire. Parthians were a nasty bunch. These guys were tough. This was the one group of people that could whip the Roman army. And these guys would actually put fear in the Roman army. They were so tough. And I have a story in the article talking about how there was a famous story where this Roman general Crassus had absolutely got whipped by the Parthians. The Parthians were outnumbered 4-1, and they decimated the Roman army. We're talking hundreds of thousands, and they only had like 10,000, something like that. And they wiped out the 100,000 army because they were experts at archery on horses. And the Parthians would actually train up little boys to be experts with archery while riding a horse. They are trained and so by the time they become adults and they become part of the army, they are unstoppable. They will get you with an arrow, running by on a horse, racing by on a horse. And so the Parthians put fear in the Roman Empire, and Roman Empire, they still used a lot of trickery to bring down the Parthian Empire. They really did their best to cause divisions within the Parthian Empire, to break them up. And then once they became divided within themselves, then the Roman Empire would come in and conquer them. The Roman Empire was a nasty group of people also, but so ultimately, I would argue that these wise men were part of the Magos that reported to the Parthian king. They were the Parthian king's spiritual hucksters that gave him advice. And in fact, there was one documentary I had watched about the Parthian Empire, and at the end of that video, they point out that in the capital of the Parthian government, they had a king, and under that king were two councils, the nobles and the magi. The Magi. They were actually called the Magi. And all the Parthian videos and articles talk about the nobles and the Magi. So how is it that the Magi learned about the birth of the Lord Jesus Christ and came to worship him? Well, I would argue, now some of the commentaries would say that, well, it's because of Daniel. You had these prophecies about the prophetic timetable with Daniel in the Babylonian Empire. And that was 500 years ago. They've always known about it. So now they know from prophecy that Jesus had to have been born, and they went to investigate. No, I don't think that's the case at all. Who pays attention to prophecies that were said 500 years ago? And plus, if you look at the history of the Parthian Empire, they changed hands quite a bit over the years after the Babylonian Empire fell. And so now it's kind of this hodgepodge of cultures. And I would just argue that you had Jews who lived in the Parthian Empire. We know that they existed. Peter went to go visit them in Babylon at the end of 1 Peter 5, I think. There were Jews who lived in the Parthian Empire. And I would argue that news about the birth of the Messiah spread like wildfire. You had Anna the prophetess in Jerusalem screaming that he had been born and telling everybody that prophecy's been fulfilled. This spread like wildfire throughout Israel. They were primed and ready and excited for the arrival of their Messiah. And I think word reached out to the Parthians, and the Parthians began to, at some point, word reached the king, and he had determined that he was going to send some of his Magos into Israel in order to go find out, give homage to Israel's new king. And so in the process of following this miraculous star to Bethlehem, they became believers. And I mean, you're talking about a week's journey going from Jerusalem to Nazareth. They didn't see him in the manger. They saw him in Nazareth about a year later. And in that process of following this miraculous star, which I would argue was Shekinah glory, that was Shekinah glory kind of thing that was that they were following, just like the Jews in the wilderness. And over the process of time, spending time with this star, they actually became believers. And when they finally saw the child, they worshiped him. I think that's what happened. And I really strongly suspect this is very much in the right ballpark. So this is a great big deep dive into that story. There's a lot of politics that's going on in Herod's palace. When the Magi arrived, the Magi talked to Herod with a lot of attitude, who, if they were Jewish wise men, they would know better than to do that, because Herod would have them killed. But Herod was scared to death talking to these Magi. Why was he scared to death talking to them? Because they came from the Parthian Empire. The Parthians could easily take over Israel if they want. And they knew that the Roman Empire probably could not be able to stop them from taking over Israel if that's what they wanted. So Herod had to really play a very cautious political game, talking to these Magi, and just help them as much as humanly possible. But I mean, it's amazing. The Magi show up to Herod of all people, who has a lot of blood on his hands, and they tell Herod, we've come to worship, to see the guy who's going to replace you. We heard he was born, and we're here to worship him, not you. And Herod just bends the knee to these guys. And the only solution that makes sense to all of that, to me, is that they had to have come from Parthia, the Parthian Empire. Which means that these words that were used to describe and the definitions would all be accurate. They were the spiritual hucksters who reported to the king. They were one of two councils who were part of the Parthian government. And then at the end, they actually became believers. They show up at Joseph and Mary's house in Nazareth. You got to imagine what Joseph and Mary must be thinking, because you've got this great entourage of Parthians who just showed up at your front door. And you're thinking, okay, what am I going to do here? And they come in and they absolutely worship Christ because of their experience, I think, with that star. And then they give Joseph and Mary all of this wealth, which was, I think, God ordained, in the sense that this was meant to be money that they were going to need in order to raise up the future Messiah of Israel. Because they're going to have a lot of expenses. Least of all, they're going to have to make a trip in the near future to Egypt to go hide from Herod. So you got to imagine what Joseph and Mary are thinking. The entourage of Parthians have come to visit us, and they're worshiping Christ. And the point of the story in Matthew is the Gentiles have come to accept Christ as the Son of God. What's your problem? What's your excuse? The Gentiles could see it. Why can't you? And then you have this story at the end of God talking to the Magi, all the Magi in visions, and telling them not to go back to Herod. Matthew 2:12. The wise men, the Magi, being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. It's just amazing. Now that they're saved, God the Father communicated with these Gentiles in their dreams. I mean, just imagine that. You just got saved, and now God the Father communicates with you in your dreams, and he tells you, don't go back to Herod. This was God the Father. This was completely unprecedented. The Father speaking to Gentiles in a dream. These guys actually heard the voice of God the Father. I'm already jealous. And he didn't simply speak to one of the magi, he spoke to all of them. He spoke to all the wise men in a dream that they should not return to Herod. Of course, God the Father didn't want them to return to Jerusalem to talk to Herod or be anywhere near Jerusalem because he didn't want Herod to find out where Jesus was located. That's why. He knew Herod. He knew what Herod was going to do with that information, and he wanted Herod to be kept in the dark. And I just find that moment also amazing. We are witnessing in this story for the first time the actual intervention of God the Father in the affairs of mankind on earth.